is Liza, so I will be kind of conducting a brief presentation going over the resiliency plan. We'll try my very best not to bore or speak too quickly. Those are some things I sometimes struggle with. We'll kind of just go do an overview of the plan, all the different components of it, talk a little bit about funding, and then at the end, if there's anything that you have any questions about, this is a curated experience just for you. So in terms of some thank you and introductions, I would like to, of course, thank and introduce New Bern staff, because I actually don't work for the City of New Bern. So this is Chris Seberg, he's the Economic Development Planner, and you've met Colleen as well, who's the Public Relations. Yeah. And so I work for a consultant firm. We're called Withers Ravenel. We're out of Raleigh, North Carolina, mainly in Cary is our headquarters. But I actually was born and raised here. Grew up in Duffield, right up the street from RCS on Main Street. So it's super cool for me. I get to work where I've grown up and lived, and to be able to talk about New Bern with my coworkers and with you all. So it's a super cool moment for me and a great place to be in. I have to tell you, please silence your phone, and your bathrooms are that way. You don't have to. This is when we have like a large group. And our bathrooms are that way, and water fountains, all that jazz. We do also have a definition sheet that you can take with you, and it just kind of goes over some of the terminology I might use today. I'm going to try and keep it simple, but if not, the definition sheet goes into some of those like buzzwords that are commonly used with resilience. So for some background, after Hurricane Florence in 2018, the city engaged consultants to model flood levels and impacts, identify risk, and develop a plan for resilience. Some of this you kind of heard in the video, so I apologize for the regurgitation. But the project started during the COVID-19 pandemic, so there were several engagement events during that time, virtually as well as in person. And the goal there was to create a resiliency and hazard mitigation plan. So we have this event that happened, we have these issues, we now have to create a plan to correct those things. So 18 months after all of the original meeting and requests from the consultants, the plan was officially adopted in January of 2022 by the Board of Aldermen. So what is resilience? There are many definitions for resilience, but for the purpose of this plan, the City of New Bern defines resilience as the capacity to withstand, respond, and recover from an adverse event. So why do we focus on resilience? There's this map here, but the even better version is this one here. So that blue and yellow shows the 100-year and the 500-year flood zone, and then on this map here, it's going to be the blue and the purple. So the blue is going to be the 100, and the 500 is going to be that purple. Essentially, to simplify it, the 100-year is like a recurrence interval, meaning that a flood of that magnitude, a flood where the levels reach blue, there is a 1% chance of that happening every year. The 500 is going to be a 1 in 500% chance, or a 0.2% chance. The reason why Florence was such a very large and big event is because you can look at the Florence inundation map, or where the water levels were for Florence, and they were pretty much mimicking that 500-year. So it's one of those things where we've never really expected to happen. Even though and I want to clarify, even though it's 500-year or 100-year, there's a chance sometimes that you can have multiple 100-year flood levels or multiple 500-year. It's just the way that the FEMA naming mechanism is. But the reason why we want to focus on resilience is because we saw those purple levels that we assume to be this once in a very rare event to happen. We saw that happen here in New Bern in 2018. So during the public engagement sector, there were 5 or 6 engagement pillars, like themes that came about in people's responses, and those became then the pillars of the plan, and we have those also highlighted in the boards. So that's health and safety, housing, economy, infrastructure, natural resources, and cultural heritage. For each of those plans, there was then created like a purpose and a goal. So for each pillar, there was a purpose in which we were creating, having that pillar there, like why this theme was important. There was then a goal from all of the different action items, and then there were different action items to kind of aid that purpose. So for health and safety, the purpose was to improve the public health and human services, not just during an adverse event, but also on a regular day. So that's looking at, do you have access to food on a regular Monday, not just after an event, because after an event, those conditions are, of course, exacerbated. For housing, it's looking at the vulnerability that was happening in existing housing. So we're looking at what, on a regular day, the vulnerability there, and then also if we have an adverse event, how can that house then respond, withstand, and recover from an adverse event? So looking at that for the purpose, and the goal there is to educate citizens on some of like the best practices as it relates to home ownership as well as home insurance. Some people who did not have flood insurance post Florence definitely have flood insurance now. My aunt and uncle who live in Sunnyside did not have flood insurance. If you know anything about that neighborhood, everyone in there needed flood insurance, and so now they have it. And also for the housing component, one of the goals there is to partner with developers for any new development, like those apartment complexes that are happening across the river. How can we make those apartment complexes focus upon resiliency from the very beginning? And any other new development, how can we work with developers and different builders to make sure that we're prioritizing resiliency even in new construction? So we're not having to have this conversation for those properties 10, 20 years from now. For economy, the purpose there was to support, enhance, and better understand the resiliency of the city's economy. I think this purpose is probably the one easiest to understand because during the time of adoption, we had businesses that were recovering from Florence as well as dealing with COVID-19. So you have those adverse and inadverse effects, right? So we have, obviously, you had some flooding, you can't open your business, but then also we are in quarantine or we're isolating and you also can't have the same level of business. So how do we make our businesses more resilient, whether it's an adverse event or if it's a global pandemic, which hopefully we don't have another one of those anytime soon, or we hopefully can not have the same magnitude of quarantine and isolation that we had before. For infrastructure, it's looking to improve, protect and improve the existing infrastructure and hoping that aids with regular everyday rain that sometimes floods out like Union Point versus when we also have like a very big storm. A big part of this one is looking at our existing capacity for our stormwater resources. So almost every apartment or subdivision usually has that pond in it that's got a fence around it. So that's your best management practice, that's your stormwater BMP. So anytime there's a storm, that water should be collecting there and it should be pulling away from the site. Does every pond have that capability at this time? So that's what the plan's looking at. So we need to do an assessment of what's existing, and then after that assessment is done, where are there different holes and where should we prioritize additional funding and additional improvements? A big part of this plan is the Duffield Stormwater Enhancement Pond. So that pond was a lot smaller. Obviously, if you've driven by, it's kind of grown in magnitude, and it's even got other phases that are associated with it. And there are other ponds throughout New Bern that we want to look at and see their capacity for stormwater currently, and then seeing if we have something of this magnitude again, how would they be able to respond, and figuring out which one takes priority to get addressed as soon as possible. For natural resources, it's working with partners and stakeholders to preserve some of our green areas in hopes that they can better withstand these adverse events. But also a goal is to design new developments with natural resources as a component for resiliency. There is a board, I believe on the other side, that talks about the Duffield Stormwater Pond enhancement. A part of that enhancement is to use it as a park component, so turning a green space into a place to retain water. And that's a very simple fix, and it's also beautiful. So it's, an easy way to combine two goals, beautification as well as resiliency. And lastly, cultural heritage. So the purpose of this one is, and the theme kind of came about, obviously, with our downtown area, right? So much of our tourism is linked to our beautiful historic area, and we want to make sure that we're preserving that. There is a little difficulty there because the main way to preserve it would be to raise all of those beautiful homes up to the flood elevation, which some of them have done. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing, so how do we find a way to still retain those spaces while preserving the historic culture? Because so much of our tourism, we know, is kind of linked to that. So for each of those purpose and goals, and each pillar was then supported by different action items. There are 61 total action items in the plan, and they range. So the number one action item is that Duffield Stormwater Pond I mentioned, because that was a critical area in which we needed resources to pull that water away. But then there's other action items like these checklists, where we created resiliency checklists for businesses and residents so they can kind of, when a storm happens, you don't want to think about, darn, did I make a copy of my social, or where's my social? This checklist, if you put it on your refrigerator, hopefully you're able to just say, oh, I've already done everything I need. On the back side, it also talks about what you might need for FEMA if you have to make a claim. FEMA will say take photos of everything. So it just gives, these checklists are an action item. Then you also have Duffield Ponds an action item, assessment of our stormwater is an action item. They range because for each pillar there's an action item. One of the ones for health and safety is actually looking at possibly having a grocery store or other access to food in areas that we know do not currently have access. Because if you're having this issue currently, after a storm, it's just going to be exacerbated. Coordinate with, for health and safety, coordinating with Craven County Health Department and stakeholders to establish health centers in those vulnerable areas, as well as establishing emergency shelters and alternative temporary housing to be utilized during and following a hazard event. These are some of those priority action items for that. For housing, is engaging with financial institutions to host some of those seminars needed about flood insurance and how to maintain your home. It's like personal finances and financial risk management. One of the big ones is not just about flood insurance being for homeowners, because that's sometimes a misperception. It's also for homeowners, renters, landlords, real estate professionals. Everyone should have a familiarity with flood insurance, especially given where we live and the beautiful view that we have and what comes with it. And then also working directly with leaders in our vulnerable, culturally significant communities where we have a lot of older homes, as well as populations that might be on a more fixed income. Like, they need to also have an alternative. We can't just assume that because they may not be able to afford these things that they shouldn't be a part of the process. So working with those leaders to figure out what alternatives and solutions there are. For economy, big part of that was these toolkits. Those were some of the action items, was the personal toolkit as well as the resiliency toolkit for businesses. And that just gives them some key things they might want to have in their home. And another goal was to possibly take these lists and then start being able to, hopefully with grant funding, creating them. So instead of saying, you need to have all these things, here's a backpack that has all these things, and you just need to personalize it for your home. So that is a goal there. And then also conducting an economic assessment to determine, we know the value our downtown area has, right? We know what it feels like to walk through and get something from Cal Cafe and like just have the nice breeze, and then walk by the Pepsi facility and then walk down the Triumph Palace. We know that value, but in order for us to request funding for grants and things, we need to also be able to tell FEMA or any other federal or local or state organization, this is the value that we've lost now because of an event. So that has to be an assessment that's done to realize that value. What is that number? We don't know yet. After the assessment, hopefully we will, and that makes it easier to then go for grants. For infrastructure, I've kind of touched on some of this, but the big one there is performing a comprehensive study of our existing stormwater system. We need to know where our weaknesses are so we can know how to patch those holes. As well as establishing a long-term emergency operations center. And that's because when these things happen, resources pull together, city staff works overtime to make sure everything's done, but it might be worth it just to establish a long-term emergency center as opposed to having our staff kind of pull from different places to fulfill that need after an event. For natural resources, we talked about a couple of these. Mainly they're in the Duffield area, so the Stormwater Enhancement Project and the Canal Restoration Project. But also, I talked a little bit about this, rain gardens, using green spaces, which are beautiful, to also facilitate stormwater runoff and collecting that water. For cultural heritage, we were talking about some of those action items are promoting new infill housing in non-flood prone areas. So looking at if we're going to have some additional culturally significant or maybe like styled homes, putting them in areas that we know are non-flood prone. So continuing character, but taking them out of an area that might be a little bit risky, so we're not putting someone in a position where 5 years from now we're having this conversation again. And then also the very last one's pretty important, is training city and county response staff for how to prepare for responding to a disaster in these culturally significant and historical areas. With a very big focus on preservation of these places and rehabilitation over reconstruction, right? Because we can't reconstruct the cultural value of those historic areas. We've got to preserve them, and when we respond to a disaster, we've got to know what to do. It might be a little bit different than you're responding to a regular home when you're responding to a home that's a couple hundred years old. So that is the scope of the plan. The 61 action items, the big portion and reason why this plan had to be is post-Florence, as it mentioned in the video, there's a ton of money that happens after disaster, right? Millions of dollars kind of flood in from local, federal, state. That money the government's like, okay, what are you going to do with it? You got to have a plan. So us adopting, or the City of New Bern, I should say, adopting the resiliency plan was a big step in making sure that in the future it's easier to have that funding facilitated directly to these initiatives and action items. So there's been a ton of progress following the development of the plan. There is still ability to provide some feedback. This website here was put together by some amazing people, and it has, wink wink, it has tons of resources. So it's got the plan itself, it's got subscriber lists, copies of these checklists. If you don't want to take a stack today, you can share it out. There's a business card there that has a QR code and the website link as well. And then there's also a list of all the different city projects, because it's been a collective effort from all the different departments, not just administration or the police department. Every single department has had a hand and a role in making New Bern more resilient, and this website gives them their shine as well as more insight into what they're doing. We've also had a couple of public outreach events. So we were at BumFest, some of the staff at New Bern Rotary, the Federal Reserve was here, and we've had this is our 4th one of these, so that's pretty exciting to have these as well. Another thing to mention, if you haven't heard about it, is New Bern Alerts. So New Bern Alerts is a free service that sends out emergency and general information via email or text. And voicemail. It's geo-targeted alerts, so you might get alerts saying, hey, this area is experiencing this power outage or something of that sort, or this area there is a street closing right now because someone is putting an AC unit on top of their building. So some of them can be a little bit more just your regular day-to-day, but in the event of emergency, this is an amazing resource to already be signed up for, because you can get those instant notices from city staff. So that's super important.
We used it a lot with the wildfire.
Yes, I got those notices even though I was not in town. So that was super cool. And then, so yeah, these are some of the different efforts that have been around the different communities. So just to kind of highlight, it's every single department is doing something, and it's a very vast list, which is a great thing because it's going to take everybody to make New Bern more resilient. So I've mentioned the checklist several times over, but this was one of the action items. So this is a super cool way to just see some of the action items in play. Some of them are a lot more grand, like, getting a new stormwater pond in an area that we didn't have one before. That's a pretty grand couple-year action item, but then there's some of them that are a lot more tangible and people can start benefiting from today. A big one is going to be the Duffield Communities area, which RCS is, I think, along this area, or maybe over here. Is this the senior facility?
Off of George.
We probably should put street signs up here. This is where the pond is.
Oh, okay.
And this is well, I'd say Stanley White, but I'm aware it's not Henderson Park, is what I should be saying. But when I made this, I definitely wrote Stanley White. So this is where that Duffield Pond is, and right now it's just really this piece, so this triangle, and this is where I live. I see it all the time. But the goal here was originally to take property purchased by the city and FEMA, and property that cannot be used again, correct? Like, it's been probably flooded over a couple of times, and if you have ever driven through here on just a rainy day, it's a lot of water that sits. So once those parcels were acquired by the city, and then some of them were acquired from FEMA, the goal there was to create a stormwater system. Originally just started out with this little pond area, and then after speaking to community members, it's like, hey, we don't really have a park. We have Henderson Park, but there's not really a park outside of that area in Duffield. And then the Head Start is located like literally right here. This is the Head Start building. So speaking with the community members, it's like, hey, that would be super cool if we have this facility that obviously helps us in the event of a flood, but also has a second value to the community by providing a green space, walkability. There was the idea of kids being able to come from Head Start to learn about biodiversity. I saw deers there recently for the first time. That was really cool. But also there's ducks there, and it's an area that has seen a decline in population over time, and not necessarily some of our buildings could use some TLC. So the idea of being able to have a park where there used to be properties that are no longer there because of flooding is kind of like a really beautiful story of like the circle of how things can go when there's intentional planning and input from the community. So I don't think we would have had the park if it hadn't had some really good input from the neighborhood. Originally, our company is the one that kind of designed this. We originally just had the improvements for the stormwater pond, and that was about it until someone said, no, we could use some walkability. And it's going to be beautiful, hopefully, once it's all done. So some challenges. obviously we got to highlight those a little bit, just because we're going to be realistic about what it takes to put forth a plan of this magnitude. So timeline for implementation is probably one of the biggest ones, because we could have a hurricane season this year that rivals what we've seen in 2018. And a lot of these initiatives and action items go on a grant funding schedule. So it kind of just la-di-das itself along. And then we have weather doing its own thing. So the timeline there is like we don't know if and when another disaster strikes. So we're trying to do as much as possible, as quickly as possible, but things have their process and their order, especially when it comes to dealing with grant funding. There's competitive funding. So we are one of a couple of beautiful coastal cities in eastern North Carolina, and so we're all kind of going after similar grants. That doesn't mean that if we get something someone else doesn't, it means we just have to split a bigger pie than assuming we're going to be the only person getting it. There's also local and federal public budget changes. So post Florence, and then also with infrastructure bill, there has been this wave of money for infrastructure, like stormwater ponds. But those types of things change. Sometimes there's not that interest, and sometimes there is, and that's how it goes. Developing partnerships can sometimes be a challenge, just because there's so many people that are doing so many great things, and you might not realize just how well people can work together unless you get everyone at the table. And then lastly, supply and worker shortages. Don't have to really highlight that too much. Everyone's hiring, but not just that. Resources are taking more time to get where they should be. If you're trying to build a house right now, it's more expensive than it was 2 years ago, and that's because the materials are more expensive and everyone's wanted them. So that's the same as it relates to infrastructure and some other things. With grant funding, you can go out to bid and you can say, hey, we found this amazing contractor to do everything, and that contractor can say, hey, yeah, unfortunately it's going to be 8 more months until I get what exactly I need for you, that specific part for that pump or that specific part for that canal restoration. And so then those are things that are we don't have control over them. We can just kind of navigate as best as possible. But even with all of that, there's still so many great things that are happening with the plan in the background. So what's next for us is hopefully we're going to have, I need to change that date, my bad. This is our last listening session, but we're going to still have the last listening session that I'm a part of, but there will still be events around resiliency going forth as much as possible. Grants we're pursuing, there are tons of grants right now, and there has been some grants awarded. So recently there was I think about $6 million was awarded to the Duffield project, which is really great. And then there's always grants that are working in the background. The firm I work for, we pretty much, that's another role we have here in New Bern, is just writing grants and hoping we can get some of those here. And then lastly, there's some upcoming budget proposals, which in the upcoming budget, there will be some resiliency things throughout the different departments as they're all trying to do their part in making New Bern more resilient. And I've talked your ear off, but is there any questions or anything that didn't make sense or anything that RCS specifically has questions about, or you?
Oh gosh, this was super comprehensive and awesome.
I was trying to keep it broad,
no,
also.
no, but you make it easy. There's no questions.
Oh, awesome.